Moritz Benyovszky. For many, this name is synonymous with desperate adventurism and an unyielding spirit. A Hungarian count who fought, escaped Siberian exile, circumnavigated the globe, and declared himself King of Madagascar. He was a mercenary, a pirate, a colonizer, and even a claimant to a throne. He defied empires, forged alliances with indigenous tribes, and forever etched his name into history books as a fearless explorer and founder of his own kingdom. But behind this dazzling facade lies not a hero, but a masterful impostor. Not a bold pioneer, but a cold-blooded swindler, whose biography is not a triumphant march, but a meticulously staged performance, where every detail served his personal, deeply cynical interests. His exploits were merely the backdrop for the most grandiose mystification of the 18th century. Moritz Benyovszky was born in 1740 in the modest estate of Verbove, Upper Hungary. He was one of 16 children born to Count Samuel Benyovszky, an officer in the Imperial Army. This might seem like a typical fate for the offspring of an impoverished, yet proud noble family within the rigid hierarchy of the Habsburg Empire. However, it was precisely in this seemingly ordinary cradle that the character traits began to form, which would later transform him into one of Europe's most extraordinary and, undoubtedly, unscrupulous adventurers. From an early age, Moritz stood out from his numerous siblings. He was not destined for the quiet life of a landowner or the routine military career that awaited many of his peers. An insatiable energy surged within him, fueled by a sharp, almost pathological hunger for recognition and power. He could not be content with the role of just another scion of impoverished nobility, lost in the shadow of more successful relatives or powerful magnates. He demanded more, far more. The true fatal turning point occurred in 1759 with the death of his father. Samuel Benyovszky's passing was not merely a personal tragedy, but a catalyst for a chain of events that forever altered Moritz's life, diverting it into an entirely different course. His inheritance, already modest, came under threat. His older brothers and sisters, guided not only by the letter of the law, but likely also by a deep personal antipathy towards their willful, audacious younger brother, began to dispute his share. Young Moritz, unwilling to accept what he perceived as such blatant injustice, entered into a fierce and extremely dirty struggle for his rights. He sought no compromises, made no attempts to negotiate, but instead pushed forward relentlessly, using any available method, from exhausting lawsuits to direct threats and even physical violence. It was then that his astonishing capacity for manipulation, his cynical disregard for accepted moral and legal norms, fully emerged. This struggle for inheritance, though it ended in temporary defeat and even forced exile from Hungary for him, became his first harsh school of survival and adventurism. He tasted the bitterness of injustice and realized that law and morality were for him merely flexible tools, not unbreakable constraints. This was the first conscious step on a path from which he would never deviate. Having lost land and status, he gained something far more valuable for his future career, an unshakable conviction that the world is inherently unjust, and only those willing to cross any line can claim what is theirs. It was then, in the heat of family feuds and his first brutal confrontations with reality, that his philosophy of absolute pragmatism, entirely devoid of ethical barriers, was born. He learned to see people not as fellow citizens, neighbors, or partners, but as potential victims or useful instruments for achieving his grand goals. This trauma, this injustice, perceived by him as a personal insult and betrayal by his family, became the point of no return, after which Moritz Benyovszky definitively transformed from a mere nobleman into a predator for whom no prohibitions or moral dilemmas existed. The mid-18th century, when Moritz Benyovszky, exiled from his homeland, found himself at a crossroads, was not just an era of change, but a true chaos in which old orders crumbled and new ones had yet to solidify. It was a time perfectly suited for individuals without principles, but with sharp minds and boundless ambition. Europe, exhausted by decades of relentless warfare, especially the bloody 7 Years' War, resembled a vast cauldron where political, economic, and social contradictions seethed. Empires, Habsburg, French, British, Russian, fiercely vied for dominance on the continent and overseas, constantly redrawing borders and forming ephemeral alliances. Every power desperately needed resources: gold, people, new lands, but above all, information and influence. This created an enormous demand for adventurers of all stripes: spies, mercenaries, unofficial diplomats capable of executing the most delicate and dirty assignments. For them, the doors of the highest offices opened, provided they could offer something valuable, no matter how dubious their methods. The economy of the time, based on mercantilism, was obsessed with colonial expansion and control over trade routes. Vast fortunes were made and lost overnight through speculation, maritime trade, and the exploitation of overseas territories. This led to an unprecedented level of financial instability and, consequently, incredible opportunities for fraud. Secret deals, forged bills of exchange, and promises of unimaginable wealth flourished. Society, though still strictly hierarchical, was experiencing invisible but profound upheavals. Traditional ties weakened, and social mobility, though limited, became possible for those willing to take risks and break the law. The information vacuum and slow communication between countries made identity or history verification virtually impossible. Anyone with sufficient charisma, acting talent, and a lack of conscience could easily impersonate anyone: an impoverished nobleman, a wealthy merchant, a war hero, or even a secret agent of the crown. It was enough to convincingly tell one's legend, supporting it with carefully selected, albeit false, details. It was in these murky waters, where truth was optional and success was measured only by the outcome achieved, that Moritz Benyovszky found his element. He stepped onto the stage of European history at a moment when the continent itself was ripe for the most incredible adventures. Exiled from home, Moritz Benyovszky began his ascent, using war as a springboard. He didn't seek glory in honest combat. His goal was survival and advancement at any cost. First, he joined the Austrian army, then the Dutch, deserting each time he saw a more advantageous opportunity or when the situation became too dangerous. These wanderings across European battlefields were not a search for calling, but a cynical maneuver that allowed him to accumulate military experience, which he later brilliantly embellished, and to evade responsibility. He mastered the art of changing guises and convincingly presenting himself as whomever was most beneficial. Returning to Hungary several years later, Moritz executed one of his first major personal schemes. He married. Anna Ziki, daughter of an influential general, became not an object of passion, but a tool for restoring his standing. This marriage, concluded in 1764, provided him not only financial support, but also much-needed connections in high society, which he immediately began to leverage for his dubious affairs. He quickly embroiled himself in questionable ventures, using his new family's name and connections, until his escapades became too obvious. When the ground once again grew too hot for him, Moritz found himself on the run. But this time he didn't just flee. He headed to Poland, where the Bar Confederation, a rebellion of Polish nobility against Russian influence, was raging. Here, in the chaos of civil war, he saw a new, truly unique opportunity. Posing as an experienced officer, a veteran of many campaigns, he quickly gained the trust of the Confederates, who desperately needed anyone who could wield a sword and command. Under his leadership, the Confederate detachments operated with varying success, but Moritz skillfully exaggerated his victories and downplayed his defeats, building a reputation as a fearless and cunning commander. His participation in these battles was less ideological than pragmatic. It was an ideal platform for honing his skills in manipulation and self-promotion. However, luck could not accompany him forever. In 1770, after one of the battles, he was captured by Russian forces. For most, this would have meant the end of a career, perhaps death or lifelong hard labor. But for Benyovszky, captivity was merely a new stage in his carefully planned game, another act of a grand spectacle. He was sent into exile to distant Kamchatka, to the very edge of the Russian Empire, a place from which it seemed there was no return. It was there, in the harsh conditions of Siberian exile, that Moritz Benyovszky conceived and executed his most audacious and legendary plan, which forever etched his name into history, transforming him from a mere fugitive into a figure of global renown. But Kamchatka, That remote corner of the earth where the most dangerous criminals and politically undesirable individuals were exiled, became for Benyovszky not a curse, but an ideal laboratory for honing his unique manipulative skills. If in Europe he had to compete with hundreds of other fortune seekers, here, in isolation, he found himself in conditions where his exceptional toolkit operated with maximum effectiveness. He did not break under the weight of Siberian frosts and despair. On the contrary, his sharp mind immediately began to analyze the new reality, seeking out its cracks, weaknesses, and hidden opportunities. Moritz Benyovszky possessed truly hypnotic charisma. This was not merely a pleasant demeanor, but a meticulously calculated strategy. He knew how to read people, unerringly identifying their hidden desires, fears, and most importantly, their price. In Kamchatka, he encountered desperate exiles who had long lost hope for freedom, and local administrators who, isolated from central authority, often suffered from corruption and indifference. He found a unique approach for each. To some, he painted pictures of unprecedented wealth and glory awaiting them beyond this icy prison. To others, he promised forgiveness and a new life under a different flag. The most stubborn, he intimidated or bribed, using the meager resources he, incredibly, managed to accumulate. His methods of influence were astonishing. He didn't just gather a crowd around him. He created a team of carefully selected experts. Among the exiles, he quickly identified former sailors, officers who knew languages, could handle weapons, or repair equipment. These individuals, once highly skilled professionals, were now reduced to convicts, and Moritz offered them not just freedom, but a return to their former status, albeit in his own emerging world. He skillfully created excitement, spreading rumors of his noble birth, his connections at European courts, and certain secret plans that were destined to change their fate. He transformed every minor victory, every successful move, into proof of his exceptionalism, fueling belief in his brilliant plan. At the same time, his personal adaptability was phenomenal. He did not disdain learning local dialects or adopting the customs of indigenous peoples if it gave him an advantage. He could be at once a charming nobleman for the governor and a fearless leader for rebellious soldiers. He made decisions on the fly, changing tactics depending on the circumstances, but always keeping his main goal in mind: liberation and further enrichment. This flexibility, combined with his unscrupulousness, allowed him to survive and prosper where others would have long perished. The escape from Kamchatka, which later became legendary, was not a burst of desperation, but a cold-blooded, calculated operation, where each participant was merely a pawn in his grand game, and Moritz Benyovszky himself, a masterful puppeteer, controlling their hopes and fears. In 1771, on the night of April 27th, Moritz Benyovszky put his plan into action. This was not a spontaneous uprising of the desperate, but a meticulously planned coup. His team of 72 individuals, former officers, sailors, soldiers, and political exiles, attacked Petropavlovsk fortress under the cover of darkness. Their first target was the governor of Kamchatka, Nilov, whom Moritz, without sentiment, ordered killed. This was not merely an escape, but an act of open rebellion against the Russian Empire, a demonstration of his readiness for any cruelty for his own gain. Having seized the fortress, arsenal, and treasury, Benyovszky immediately proceeded to implement the second part of his plan. He took possession of the only large ship in the harbor, the packet boat, St. Peter and St. Paul. In the holds, besides provisions and weapons, was Kamchatka's gold reserve, fur pelts, which he later intended to use as starting capital. Raising some flag of his own over the vessel, symbolizing his newly found freedom, Moritz Benyovszky and his motley crew, consisting of his victims and accomplices, weighed anchor. Behind them, they left the smoldering ruins of a destroyed prison and the bloody imprint of his unscrupulousness. The journey across the Pacific Ocean, which later became one of the pillars of his legend, was less an exploratory feat than a forced maneuver. He avoided encounters with Russian ships, fearing retribution, and steered his vessel south through unknown waters to the coasts of Japan and then Taiwan and Macau. In each port, he performed a new act of his spectacle, presenting himself as a Russian nobleman, a Polish exile, or a brave explorer. His tales of Siberia and Kamchatka's untold riches, its unexplored lands, and secret trade routes sounded incredible, but were convincing enough for European merchants and colonizers eager for new opportunities. Upon arriving in Europe in 1772, Moritz Benyovszky immediately headed to Paris. France, the main geopolitical adversary of Russia, proved to be ideal ground for his grand plans. Here, he presented himself to the French court not as an escaped convict and murderer, but as a victim of Russian despotism, a heroic explorer possessing unique knowledge of strategically important territories. He skillfully exploited anti-Russian sentiments at court, portraying himself as an invaluable source of information capable of helping France undermine its rival's influence. His main antagonist at this stage was not only the Russian Empire, which sought to capture him, but also the truth itself, which he meticulously concealed. His patrons became influential French ministers and financiers who, blinded by his charisma and promises of untold profits, saw in him a tool to realize their own ambitions. They craved new colonies, new trade routes, new sources of raw materials, and Benyovszky, like a talented marketer, sold them exactly what they wanted to hear. He convinced them that Kamchatka and its adjacent lands could become a new French colony, and he himself its governor. His audacious escape from Siberian exile, which for others would have been a shameful brand, was transformed in his hands into the most powerful argument for his exceptionalism and indomitable spirit. He was ready to promise any wealth, any strategic advantage, just to obtain the necessary resources and support for the realization of his next, even more insane scheme. And France, blinded by promises, believed him. In 1773, having received the rank of colonel, a significant sum of money, and authority to establish a colony, Moritz Benyovszky set off for Madagascar. He arrived on the island in 1774, choosing the eastern coast to establish his outpost. Here, far from the watchful eye of European capitals, he unfolded his most ambitious and, perhaps, most audacious spectacle. His actions in Madagascar were a typical manifestation of his boundless cynicism and masterful adaptability. He wasn't just building a fortress, he was building an illusion. On one hand, he presented himself as a French envoy, bringing civilization and prosperity. On the other, he skillfully ingratiated himself with local tribes, studying their customs, participating in their rituals, and even declaring himself a descendant of ancient Malagasy kings. This last lie became his most significant yet fatal error. He played on the ambitions of the chiefs, promising them power and wealth under his protection, and on their fears, demonstrating the might of his European weapons. His goal was not colonization in the traditional sense, but the creation of a personal principality where he would rule unchallenged. The culmination of this madness occurred in 1776, when Moritz Benyovszky, at the peak of his self-proclaimed authority, declared himself King of Madagascar. He organized a lavish ceremony where local chiefs, misled or intimidated, recognized him as their ruler. He dreamed of creating an independent state, minted his own coins, formed an army from local inhabitants, and even wrote a constitution. This was the apotheosis of his adventure, the moment when he seemed to have reached the summit of his wildest fantasies. But it was this very step, this act of absolute unsubstantiated imposture, that marked the beginning of his end. In Paris, where only fragmented and embellished reports of his successes arrived, doubts began to mount. The French government, which had invested significant funds in his enterprise, expected a profitable colony, not a self-proclaimed monarch. The absence of promised trade routes, gold mines, and strategic benefits, coupled with Benyovszky's constantly growing demands for new resources and reinforcements, made the court wary. His letters, full of high-flown declarations about a kingdom, began to elicit suspicion rather than admiration. To clarify the situation, in 1777, Paris dispatched a special commission to Madagascar. Its purpose was not only to assess the true state of affairs, but in essence, to conduct an investigation. What they discovered was a complete exposé. Instead of a thriving colony and a strategically important outpost, the commission found only ruin, discontent among local tribes, and an ambitious adventurer who had essentially embezzled the allocated funds and built a fictitious kingdom on sand. His exploits turned out to be merely a facade, concealing blatant embezzlement and deception. The Commission's report was damning. It labeled Benyovszky a dangerous adventurer and his activities detrimental to the interests of France. Support was immediately withdrawn. His grand Malagasy adventure, which was supposed to elevate him to the pinnacle of world politics, turned into a complete failure and a shameful expulsion. In 1778, abandoned by France and having lost control over his kingdom, Moritz Benyovszky was forced to leave Madagascar. His journey back to Europe was that of an already exposed, yet still incredibly dangerous player, for whom defeat was merely a temporary respite before a new attempt to overturn the world. Benyovszky's departure from Madagascar left behind not just disappointment, but tangible financial and reputational losses for France. Millions of livres invested by the French crown in this colonial project vanished without a trace, bringing neither the promised precious metal deposits, nor strategically important trade routes, nor valuable spices. In fact, nothing that Benyovszky had so masterfully described in his reports actually existed. Private investors, whom Moritz Benyovszky had convinced of the unprecedented prospects of the Malagasy enterprise, lost their capital, falling victim to a masterful financial fraud. The French government, publicly disgraced and financially damaged, chose to quietly wind down all operations on the island. No high-profile investigations or attempts to bring Benyovszky to justice followed. Instead, Paris sought to distance itself from the scandalous adventurer as quickly and discreetly as possible, declaring him persona non grata. His name was erased from official documents, and all mentions of his exploits in Madagascar became undesirable. This fiasco dealt a serious blow to France's colonial ambitions in the Indian Ocean, causing doubts about the effectiveness of such ventures and the reliability of such heroes whose promises sounded too good to be true. For the French crown, this episode was not only a significant financial failure but also a lesson, demonstrating that even the most brilliant and convincing promises can be merely a smokescreen, concealing emptiness and unprincipled deception. Abandoned by France, Moritz Benyovszky did not vanish into obscurity. His story, seemingly concluded by a shameful fiasco, was only beginning its journey to immortality, but in an entirely different capacity. The paradox of his legacy lies precisely in how this masterful deceiver, whose exploits were merely meticulously staged scenes, managed to transform in the collective consciousness from an adventurer into a hero, from a swindler into a fearless pioneer. He didn't just tell his story, he created it, understanding that in a world craving miracles, fiction is often more convincing than facts. His escape from Siberia, his circumnavigation, his kingdom in Madagascar, all of it, seasoned with incredible details and heroic pathos, became the foundation for a myth that would overshadow the truth for decades and then centuries. People wanted to believe in him. They longed for heroic narratives about a man who defied fate and empires. Herein lies the ultimate irony. Moritz Benyovszky, who built his entire life on deceit, himself became a victim of a grand mystification, but not his own, rather one created by history. His name, etched in the annals of adventurism, paradoxically transformed into a symbol of audacity and freedom, though behind this facade lay only cold calculation and a complete absence of moral barriers. He was a master of self-promotion in an era when public relations was just emerging. He sold himself to the world, and the world bought his legend wholesale, without bothering to look behind the scenes. The story of Moritz Benyovszky is not just the biography of one exceptional liar. It is a universal lesson about the power of narrative, about how easily myth can supplant reality, especially when that myth answers a deep human need for heroic figures. It shows how vulnerable even powerful states and enlightened minds can be in the face of unrestrained charisma and absolute, unprincipled pragmatism. His life is a mirror reflecting not only his own dishonesty, but also the naivety, and at times cynicism, of those who were willing to believe the most incredible promises for their own gain. Ultimately, Benyovszky didn't just deceive his contemporaries, he deceived history itself, forcing it for decades to celebrate him as a hero, while hiding behind the shining facade of adventurism only emptiness and the abyss of moral decline.